The alarm in my ear screamed before I even opened my eyes. Red light. Not the soft warning glow. The real one. The one that meant someone on this station was about to die, and it might be me. I rolled off the cot in my small quarters on the embassy deck, my boots already half-laced from the night before, because on Kesser Prime, you never fully undressed. Not when you were the only human liaison on an alien homeworld surrounded by 900 beings who still weren't sure if your species was a gift or a threat. My name is Nathan Cole. 3 months ago I was a junior translator with a decent apartment and a coffee habit. Now I was humanity's only voice, on a planet ruled by a queen whose people could feel your soul the moment their skin touched yours. I ran down the corridor toward the sound of shouting, my heart slamming against my ribs. The lights along the wall pulsed amber, then red, then amber again, like the station itself was struggling to breathe. A Velmori guard, tall and pale blue, with eyes like polished glass, grabbed my arm as I turned the corner. "Do not move," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The Queen is here." I froze, not because he told me to, because of what that meant. The Queen of the Velmori never left her private tower, not for trade meetings, not for treaties, not for anything. Her own ministers barely saw her outside of formal ceremony. And now, somehow, she was on the embassy deck, in the middle of a lockdown, at the worst possible hour. I had exactly 4 seconds to process that information before the world hit me. Literally. Something crashed into my chest with the force of a falling crate, and I stumbled backward, arms instinctively wrapping around whatever had struck me so I wouldn't fall flat on my back and take them down with me. I felt fabric, cool and smooth like woven glass. I felt someone gasping for breath against my shoulder. I felt fear. And I did what any human does when someone crashes into them, shaking and breathless in the dark. I held on. I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about diplomacy. I didn't think about the 11-page document I had signed on my first day that explained, in excruciating detail, exactly which parts of a Velmori body a foreigner was legally permitted to look at, let alone touch. My body reacted the way every human body reacts when someone stumbles into your arms in the dark and gasps like they've just survived something terrible. I hugged them, one arm around the back, one hand steadying a shoulder, my voice low and automatic. Hey, I've got you. You're okay." The lights in the corridor snapped, from red to full white, in the same instant, and that was when I understood exactly how badly I had misjudged the last 4 seconds of my life. The person in my arms was small compared to me, wrapped in a plain gray travel cloak instead of the ceremonial robes I had seen in every portrait and broadcast since I arrived. Her hood had slipped back, silver hair, cropped close to her skull, eyes the color of deep water, wide and startled, looking directly into mine from a distance of maybe 6 inches. I recognized her face from 1,000 official images. I was hugging the Queen of the Velmori Empire. Around us, the corridor filled with the sound of metal sliding against metal, fast and sharp, a sound I had learned to fear during my very first security briefing. Guards, 6 of them, maybe more, weapons rising from their hips in one smooth, practiced motion, every one of them aimed at me. "Release her," one of them barked, a woman with markings down the side of her face that meant she commanded the personal guard. Her weapon didn't waver. "Release the Queen immediately, or you will be ended where you stand." My arms did not move, not because I was brave, because my brain had short-circuited somewhere between hug and death threat, and my body hadn't caught up yet. I didn't. My voice cracked. She fell into me. I was just, "Release her." I let go so fast I nearly knocked her over a second time. I stepped back with both hands raised, palms open. The universal gesture I had been told meant surrender on at least 4 different worlds, and prayed it meant the same thing here. 6 weapons stayed locked on my chest. My pulse hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm was still cycling red and amber, forgotten by everyone except the machine that generated it. I thought about my mother. I thought about the letter I hadn't finished writing to her the night before. The one where I still hadn't told her that the embassy doctors had found something wrong with her test results back on Earth, something I had learned in a message only 6 hours ago, and hadn't slept since. I thought about how strange it was that the last thing I might ever do was hold a stranger who happened to rule an empire, simply because my body remembered, faster than my mind could stop it, what comfort was supposed to feel like. The guard commander's finger tightened on her weapon. Then the queen laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a diplomatic sound meant to smooth over an awkward moment. A real laugh, short and surprised, like it had been startled out of her, the same way her cloak had been startled off her shoulders. Every guard in that corridor froze. I froze too, mostly because I had never actually heard a Velmori laugh before. In 3 months on this station, I had seen exactly one recorded moment of the Queen's face shifting into something like amusement, and analysts back on Earth had spent 2 full days debating what it meant. She straightened her cloak with one hand, still catching her breath, and looked at her guard commander with an expression I could not read at all. "Lower your weapons," she said. The commander did not move. "My queen, he touched you. Unsanctioned contact against the sovereign is—" "I am aware of the law, Vashka. I wrote half of it myself." The queen's voice was calm now, almost amused, though something underneath it still trembled faintly, like a struck bell settling. "Lower your weapons. That is an order, not a suggestion." One by one, the guards obeyed, though not one of them took their eyes off me. The commander lowered hers last, and slowest, her jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle working beneath her pale skin. The queen turned back to face me fully for the first time. Up close, she looked younger than every portrait I had ever seen of her, and far more tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes that no official image had ever shown. Her breathing was still slightly uneven. "You are the human," she said. It wasn't a question. "Nathan Cole." My voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hands were still raised. "Liaison to the embassy. I am so sorry. I didn't know it was you. I didn't mean to. Stop apologizing." She said it without heat, almost gently, tilting her head at me the way I had seen my old university professor look at a student who had just answered a question wrong, in a genuinely interesting way. "Do you know what you just did? Broke about 6 laws? You touched the Queen of the Velmori Empire without invitation, without ceremony, and without permission, in a manner explicitly forbidden by the Second Accord of Contact." She listed it off like she was reading a menu, and somehow that made it worse. "The punishment for that, Nathan Cole, is death, immediate and without appeal." The corridor was so silent I could hear the recycled air moving through the vents above us. "I understand," I said, because there was nothing else to say. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my chin up. If I was going to die on an alien space station 4 months into the most important job of my life, I wasn't going to do it staring at the floor. The Queen studied me for a long moment, long enough that the guard commander's hand drifted back toward her weapon, uncertain, waiting for a word that would not come. Then the Queen smiled. It wasn't a small smile. It wasn't the careful, measured expression I had seen in every broadcast, every treaty signing, every formal greeting recorded since first contact. It was wide and real, and it changed her entire face into something I had never once seen an official image capture. "Do it again," she said. I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The thing you just did, with your arms." She gestured vaguely at herself, at the space where I had held her only a moment before. "Do it again." Behind her, I watched the guard commander's expression crack for just a second, somewhere between horror and disbelief, before she smoothed it back into stone. "My queen," Vashka said carefully, "with respect, the human just violated." "I know exactly what he violated, Vashka. I was there." The queen didn't look away from me. Her eyes were bright now, sharp with something that looked almost like hunger, though not the dangerous kind. Something closer to curiosity, or longing. "In 31 years, no one on this station, in this empire, on any of our worlds, has ever touched me, without calculating exactly what they wanted from it first. Every hand that has ever reached for me has done so with a plan behind it, a vote to secure, a treaty to sweeten, a weakness to test." She took one step closer to me, and I noticed the guards tense as a single unit, though none of them moved. "You didn't calculate anything," she said quietly. "You just caught me." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the only true thing I had. "You were falling. I wasn't going to let you hit the floor." Something shifted in her face when I said it. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the shadows under her eyes went a little deeper, and a little softer at the same time. No, she said. I don't suppose you were. She turned to Vashka, and her voice snapped back into the sharp, commanding tone I recognized from every broadcast I had studied before arriving on this station. Take him to the private wing, not the cells. The private wing. See that he is fed and given proper quarters. Vashka's mouth opened, closed, opened again. My queen, the law demands. The law demands execution for unsanctioned contact against my will. The queen's eyes didn't leave mine as she said it. This was not against my will, Vashka. I asked him to catch me. I simply did not expect him to hold on afterward. That was not, as far as I could remember through the fog of adrenaline still roaring through my system, exactly what had happened. But I was not about to argue with the one person in the room who had just talked 6 armed guards out of ending my life in a hallway. Vashka's jaw tightened, but she bowed, low and precise, the kind of bow that clearly cost her something. As you command. The queen looked at me one last time before she turned to go, her gray cloak settling back around her shoulders, her hood rising to hide the silver hair and the tired eyes, and the smile that 6 armed guards had just watched break every rule she herself had written. We will speak again, Nathan Cole, she said. Soon. Then she was gone, moving down the corridor with a small cluster of guards falling into step around her, leaving me standing there, with my hands still faintly raised, my heart still hammering, and absolutely no idea whether I had just survived the worst mistake of my life, or stumbled into something far bigger than I understood. Vashka stepped in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet her eyes. Up close, her markings seemed to pulse faintly under the corridor lights, some kind of bioluminescent pattern I hadn't noticed before. Whatever you think just happened, she said quietly, so only I could hear it. You are wrong. The queen does not smile. The queen does not laugh. And the queen has never, in 31 years, asked anyone to touch her twice. I didn't ask her to fall into me either, I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. Vashka's eyes narrowed, studying my face, like she was trying to read a language she had never encountered before. No, she said finally. I don't suppose you did. She turned on her heel and gestured sharply for me to follow, and as I fell into step behind her, walking away from the corridor where I had nearly died and somehow, impossibly, hadn't, one thought kept circling through my mind, louder than the fading alarm, louder than my own racing pulse. I had come to this station to build a bridge between 2 species who barely understood each other. I had not expected to build it with my arms. They put me in a room 3 times the size of my old quarters, with a window that looked out over the pale green rings of Kessar Prime, and I spent the first 2 hours convinced it was a very comfortable place to wait for an execution. Nobody came to explain anything. A silent attendant brought food I didn't touch, and water I drank only because my mouth had gone completely dry somewhere around the moment 6 weapons had been aimed at my chest. I sat on the edge of a bed that was too soft for someone whose nerves were still firing like a burst pipe, and I stared at the door, waiting for it to open on Vashka's face, or worse, on nothing at all, just the quiet click of a lock that meant the decision had already been made. Instead, 3 hours later, the door opened on someone I didn't recognize. He was Velmori, older than most of the guards I had seen, with faint silver lines threading through the pale blue skin along his jaw, the kind of marking that I had learned, during my crash course in Velmori customs, indicated rank among the scholar class rather than the military one. He wore dark robes instead of armor, and he carried a thin data tablet against his chest like a shield. Nathan Cole, he said, not quite a question, though he clearly already knew the answer. I am Doran, first advisor to the Crown on matters of contact and custom. I have been asked to speak with you. Am I being executed? I asked, because I had decided somewhere around hour 2 that I would rather know than keep guessing. Doran's expression did something complicated, somewhere between amusement and discomfort. Not today. Possibly not at all, depending on what happens in the next several hours. May I sit? I gestured at the chair across from me, and he lowered himself into it, with the careful precision of someone whose joints didn't quite match the furniture they were sitting in. I need you to understand something, he said, setting the tablet on his lap without looking at it. What happened in that corridor was not a small thing. It was not a diplomatic misstep that can be smoothed over with an apology and a formal letter. Do you know why physical contact is forbidden with any member of the royal bloodline, Nathan Cole? I was told it was about respect, tradition. It is about survival. Doran's voice sharpened slightly. My people are not like yours. When Velmori skin touches Velmori skin, we do not simply feel warmth or pressure. We feel each other. Every unshielded touch opens a channel. Emotion flows both directions, unfiltered, unless the parties have trained for years to control it. Among common citizens, this is managed carefully, through ritual, through consent, through years of discipline. Among the royal bloodline, it is forbidden entirely, except under the most controlled ceremonial conditions, because the queen's mind carries the emotional weight of an entire empire. If she opens herself to an untrained touch, she does not simply feel your feelings, Nathan Cole. She feels everything you are carrying, all of it, at once, with no wall between her mind and yours. I sat very still, letting that settle into place beside the memory of the corridor, of her gasping against my shoulder, of the way her eyes had gone wide and startled the instant our arms met. She felt me, I said slowly. When I hugged her, she felt whatever I was feeling. Yes. I hadn't slept in almost 2 days, I said, mostly to myself now. I'd just gotten a message from home. My mother is sick. They found something in her last scan, and the doctors won't know how serious it is for another 2 weeks, and I've been sitting with that alone because there's no one else on this station who would understand what that even means. And then the alarm went off, and then she just fell into me. Doran was quiet for a moment, watching me, with an expression I couldn't quite name. That, he said finally, explains a great deal. Explains what? Why she smiled. I looked up at him. I don't understand. Doran set the tablet aside entirely now, leaning forward, his silver markings catching the light from the window behind me. The Queen has been touched exactly 11 times in her adult life, Nathan Cole. Each of those 11 times was ceremonial, planned weeks or months in advance, conducted under strict psychic shielding, with advisors and physicians standing by to monitor the exchange. Each time, she felt exactly what the other person intended her to feel. Loyalty, performed. Respect, performed. Devotion, performed. Every single touch she has ever known has been a transaction, carefully rehearsed, because everyone who has ever reached for her hand understood exactly what they wanted from the moment their skin met hers. He paused. You did not perform anything for her. You caught a falling stranger in a dark corridor and held on because your body told you to, and in doing so, you gave her the one thing 31 years on the throne has never allowed her to have, an unguarded feeling, worry, not for herself, but for someone else entirely, exhaustion that had nothing to do with politics. Grief you hadn't even fully allowed yourself to feel yet, for a mother half a galaxy away. She felt all of it, Nathan Cole, in the space of maybe 4 seconds, and none of it was about her at all. My throat felt tight. I didn't mean for her to feel any of that. I know. Doran's voice softened slightly. That is precisely why it worked. I sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the pale green rings turning slowly beyond the window, trying to understand what it meant that the most powerful person on this entire station had just spent 31 years surrounded by careful, rehearsed hands, and the first honest thing she had ever felt from another living being was a stranger's worry about his sick mother. So what happens now? I asked. Doran picked the tablet back up, scrolling through something with quick, practiced fingers. Now, the court decides what to do with you. There will be factions who see this as exactly the danger our laws were written to prevent. An outsider, untrained, unshielded, gaining unrestricted access to the Queen's mind by pure accident. They will argue, correctly, that if it happened once by accident, it could happen again by design, and that is a vulnerability no empire can allow to stand unaddressed. And the other side? The other side, Doran said carefully, has already been decided by the Queen herself, though she has not yet announced it to the full court. She has requested a private audience with you. My stomach dropped. When? Tomorrow. Alone. Doran met my eyes. I would advise you to think very carefully about what you say to her, Nathan Cole. Not because she wishes to trap you, because for the first time in longer than I have served her, I watched her walk away from that corridor looking like someone who had just remembered something she had forgotten she was missing. He stood, smoothing his dark robes, and paused at the door. "There is something else you should know," he said, not turning around. "Vashka has already filed a formal objection with the Council of Blood, invoking the Second Accord in full. She is requesting your execution be carried out regardless of the Queen's wishes, on the grounds that the Queen's judgment cannot be considered sound in matters concerning her own safety. Can she do that? She commands the Queen's personal guard, and comes from one of the oldest bloodlines on this world. She can do a great many things." Doran finally turned to look at me, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, something like genuine concern crossed his face. "You survived a corridor full of weapons today, Nathan Cole. Tomorrow, you will need to survive something far more dangerous. A room full of people who have spent their entire lives believing they understand exactly what keeps their queen safe, and who are about to be told, by a stranger from a species they barely trust, that they have been wrong the whole time." He left without another word, and the door sealed shut behind him with a soft, final click that sounded nothing like an execution, and somehow felt exactly as heavy as one. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat by the window and watched the rings of Kessler Prime catch the distant light of its twin suns, turning pale green to gold and back again, and I thought about my mother, half a galaxy away, unaware that her son had accidentally started what might become either the greatest diplomatic breakthrough in human history, or the reason humanity's entire embassy program got shut down before it had properly begun. Somewhere around the 4th hour of staring at those rings, a soft chime sounded at the door, and it slid open without anyone announcing themselves first. The Queen stood in the doorway, alone, without a single guard beside her, wrapped again in the plain gray travel cloak from the corridor, her hood down, her silver hair catching the low light of the room. I stood so fast I nearly knocked the chair over. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, before I could stop myself. "Not alone, not without. I am the Queen, Nathan Cole." A faint smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. "I go where I choose. Vashka is going to have a heart attack when she finds out. Vashka already knows. She is standing outside that door right now, radiating displeasure so intensely I could feel it 3 corridors away." The Queen stepped further into the room, and the door slid shut behind her, sealing us both inside together. I told her I needed to see for myself whether what I felt in that corridor was real, or whether exhaustion and shock had simply made me imagine something that was never there. And she studied me for a long moment, her eyes tracing my face with an intensity that made my skin feel warm, despite the cool air of the room. "Sit with me," she said instead of answering. "Not close. Across the room, if it makes you more comfortable. I only wish to talk." I sat, slowly, and she settled into the chair Doran had used hours before, folding her hands in her lap with the kind of careful stillness that I was beginning to understand was not natural to her at all, but trained, practiced, a habit built over 31 years of being watched by everyone around her. "Tell me about your mother," she said quietly. I blinked. "What?" "Doran told me what he learned from you today. I want to hear it from you. Not because I wish to invade your privacy the way I accidentally did in that corridor." Her voice caught slightly on the word accidentally, and something flickered across her face, quick and uncertain. "Because I find that I want to know you, Nathan Cole. Not as a symbol of your species, not as a diplomatic incident to be resolved by tomorrow's court session, as yourself." I looked at her for a long moment, this queen who ruled an empire I still barely understood, who had spent 31 years surrounded by rehearsed hands and calculated smiles, sitting across from me in a borrowed gray cloak, asking me to tell her about my mother like it was the most important question in the galaxy. "Her name is Grace," I said finally. "She raised me alone after my father left. She used to work 2 jobs just so I could study languages, instead of something practical, because she said the world needed more people who could actually understand each other, instead of just talking past one another." The Queen's eyes never left mine as I spoke, and for the first time since the alarm had gone off in my ear that morning, my chest loosened just slightly, the tight knot of fear I had been carrying since the corridor easing, if only a little. "She sounds," the Queen said softly, "like someone worth being afraid for." "She is." "Then I am sorry," the Queen said, and there was nothing rehearsed about it at all, "that my world gave you one more thing to be afraid of, on top of everything you were already carrying." We sat together in that quiet room for a long time after that, the pale rings of Kesser Prime turning slowly beyond the window, and for the first time since I had arrived on this station, I did not feel like a liaison representing an entire species. I simply felt like myself, sitting across from someone who, for the first time in her own life, finally did too. The court session began with a sound I had never heard before, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the floor of the great chamber, like the station itself was announcing my arrival, and I understood, walking through those tall doors with Doran at my side, that whatever happened in the next hour would decide far more than just my own fate. The chamber was circular, tiered like an amphitheater, packed with Velmori nobles and advisors in robes of deep blue and silver, all of them turning to watch me cross the floor toward the center, where a single raised platform waited beneath a wide window that showed the pale rings of Kesser Prime stretching endlessly behind the Queen's empty throne. She was not seated yet. I had learned from Doran, during the tense walk from my quarters, that the Queen would not take her throne until the matter had been formally presented, a tradition meant to ensure she heard every argument as a listener, before she ruled as a sovereign. Vashka stood near the front of the gathered nobles, her posture rigid, her expression carved from stone. Beside her stood a tall Velmori man I hadn't seen before, older, his robes marked with symbols I didn't recognize, radiating the kind of quiet authority that made the surrounding nobles instinctively lean away from him. "Who is that?" I whispered to Doran. "Lord Threll," Doran murmured back, barely moving his lips, "head of the Council of Blood. He has opposed every expansion of contact with your species since the first survey ship reached our border. He will not be gentle with you." I swallowed hard and kept walking. The center platform rose slightly as I stepped onto it, lifting me just enough that every eye in the chamber could find me without effort, which felt significantly less comforting than it probably was intended to be. Doran took a position at the base of the platform, close enough to advise me if needed, though the look on his face suggested he understood, as I did, that nothing he said would matter as much as what came out of my own mouth in the next few minutes. A side door opened, and the chamber fell utterly silent. The Queen entered wearing full ceremonial robes for the first time since I had met her. Deep blue fabric shot through with threads of silver that caught the light with every step. Her hair swept back beneath a thin circlet that marked her as sovereign, rather than simply a woman who had fallen into a stranger's arms in a dark corridor. She looked, in that moment, exactly like every portrait I had studied before arriving on this station, distant and untouchable, and entirely unlike the person who had sat across from me the night before, asking about my mother. She crossed to her throne, and the entire chamber rose as one, bowing low. I followed a half-second late, unfamiliar with the choreography, and caught Vashka's narrowed eyes watching my mistake with something close to satisfaction. The Queen sat. "This session is called," she said, her voice carrying easily to every tier of the chamber without any visible effort, "to address the matter of unsanctioned contact between the sovereign and the human liaison known as Nathan Cole. Lord Threll, you may present the concerns of the council." Threll stepped forward with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had given this exact speech in his own mind 100 times before ever speaking it aloud. "My Queen," he began, "for 300 years, the Second Accord has protected this throne from a vulnerability our enemies have exploited before, and would exploit again given the chance. Any being who touches you without training, without shielding, gains access to your unguarded mind. This is not a matter of custom. It is a matter of security. Yesterday, a human, untrained in our ways, unshielded by any ceremonial preparation, gained exactly that access, by his own admission, entirely by accident." He turned slightly, gesturing toward me without quite looking at me directly. "I do not question the human's intent. I do not believe he planned what happened in that corridor. But intent is not the danger here, my Queen. The danger is precedent. If it happened once by accident, our enemies will study exactly how it happened, and they will find a way to make it happen again, deliberately, the next time they wish to see inside your mind without your permission. We cannot allow sentiment, however genuine, to override 300 years of hard-earned protection." A murmur of agreement rippled through several tiers of the chamber, and I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you propose, Lord Threll?" the Queen asked, her voice giving away nothing. "Execution, in accordance with the Second Accord, carried out publicly. so that every being on this station, and every world watching our broadcasts, understands that this throne cannot be approached carelessly, regardless of how that carelessness came about. Threll's voice remained perfectly measured, as if he were discussing trade tariffs rather than my death, and immediate expulsion of the entire human embassy from Velmori space, effective within the cycle, to ensure this vulnerability is not repeated. The chamber went very quiet. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, but I kept my eyes on the Queen rather than on Threll, because Doran had told me, during our walk, that whatever happened in this room, the only opinion that mattered in the end was hers. The Queen's expression did not change, but her eyes moved to me for just a moment, steady and unreadable, before returning to Threll. "Noted," she said simply. "Vashka, you share this position?" Vashka stepped forward, her jaw tight. "My Queen, I command your personal guard, because I have sworn my life to your protection. I do not question your judgment lightly, but I watched you smile at a man who had just violated the very law you wrote to protect yourself, and I do not understand it. And what I do not understand, I cannot protect you from." Something in the Queen's expression softened, just slightly, hearing that. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone in this chamber has said to me in months, Vashka. Thank you." She rose from her throne, and the chamber straightened, watching her descend the short steps toward the platform where I stood, every eye in the room following her movement, with a kind of held breath. "I would like to address the council directly," she said, turning to face the gathered nobles, rather than looking at me. "Not as your sovereign issuing a ruling from a distance, but as the person who was actually standing in that corridor when this happened." She paused, and the silence in the chamber deepened. "I have been touched 11 times in my adult life," she said, and I watched several nobles shift uncomfortably at the bluntness of it. Each of those 11 times, I felt exactly what the toucher intended me to feel, because each of those 11 times was rehearsed, shielded, and planned weeks in advance. I have spent 31 years being told that this is what safety feels like: controlled, managed, predictable. Her hands folded in front of her, and I saw, for just a moment, the same careful stillness I had noticed the night before in my quarters, the trained composure of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. 2 days ago, exhausted and frightened after a difficult message from home, I stumbled in a dark corridor during a security lockdown, and a stranger caught me before I fell. He did not calculate what I might feel. He did not perform loyalty or devotion or respect. He simply held on, the way his own species holds one another when someone stumbles, because that is what comfort looks like where he comes from. Her voice did not waver. In that moment, for the first time in my adult life, I felt something from another living being that had nothing to do with my throne, my bloodline, or my power. I felt worry, for a mother he had not yet told me was ill. I felt exhaustion that belonged entirely to him. I felt kindness offered with no calculation behind it whatsoever. She turned finally to look at me, and something in her eyes made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. "Lord Threll believes this is a vulnerability," she continued, addressing the chamber again. "And he is not wrong that it could be exploited by someone with darker intentions than Nathan Cole possessed. But I would remind this council that for 300 years, we have defended this throne by making certain that no one could ever touch me without an agenda. And in 300 years of that protection, my family has grown steadily more isolated, more distant from our own people, more surrounded by carefully performed loyalty, and less by anything real. We have protected the throne, and in doing so, we have slowly hollowed out the person sitting on it." The chamber was utterly silent now, every noble frozen in place, watching their queen say something none of them had ever heard her say before. "I am not proposing we abandon the second accord," she said. "I am proposing we examine why an entire empire has organized itself around the belief that an unguarded touch is only ever a weapon, when I have just discovered, by accident, that it can also be the truest kindness I have ever known." Threll stepped forward, his composure cracking slightly for the first time. "My queen, with respect, one accidental kindness does not undo 300 years of documented threats. What of the next hand that reaches for you, claiming the same innocent intent, while planning something far darker?" "That," the Queen said, "is precisely why I do not propose removing the law entirely. I propose we study what happened, properly, openly, with Nathan Cole's cooperation and the full oversight of this council, so that we might understand the difference between a threat and a kindness, rather than assuming every unguarded touch must be the former, simply because we have never encountered the latter before. She looked at me then, and something passed between us that felt less like a queen addressing a diplomatic incident, and more like someone silently asking whether I would stand beside her in this, whatever came next. I stepped forward on the platform, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, given that every eye in the chamber was suddenly on me instead of her. I can't speak for my whole species, I said, but I can tell you that where I come from, holding someone who is falling isn't a political act. It's not a claim on their throne, or their power, or their secrets. It's just what people do for each other, especially strangers, especially in the dark, especially when someone is scared. I didn't know who she was when I caught her. I would have done exactly the same thing for anyone. And that, Threll said sharply, is precisely the danger. You would do the same for anyone, which means anyone could learn to imitate what you did, and use it exactly as a weapon. Maybe, I said, meeting his eyes. But you could say the same thing about any kindness ever offered anywhere. A person could learn to fake gratitude, or loyalty, or love, and use those as weapons too. That doesn't mean the real versions of those things aren't worth protecting. It just means you have to learn how to tell the difference. And I think, from what I've seen the last 2 days, your queen just proved she's better at telling that difference than anyone in this room is giving her credit for. The chamber stayed silent for a long moment after that, and I watched something shift across several of the nobles' faces. Not agreement exactly, but the beginning of doubt in whatever certainty they had walked into this room carrying. The queen returned to her throne, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the full weight of her authority, calm and absolute. I am ordering a formal study, to be overseen jointly by Doran, first advisor to the crown, and the human embassy's chosen representative. Nathan Cole will remain on this station under protective custody, not as a prisoner, but as a participant in that study, with full legal protection extended for the duration. The second accord remains in force. No further unsanctioned contact will occur without oversight. She paused, her eyes sweeping the chamber once more. But I will not execute a man for catching me when I fell, simply because my empire has never learned what to do with kindness that asks for nothing in return. If that makes me the first sovereign in 300 years to question the wisdom of total isolation, then let history record that I asked the question, rather than simply inheriting the silence. Threll bowed stiffly, his jaw tight with clear disagreement, but he did not challenge her ruling further. Vashka's expression remained troubled, but something in her posture had eased slightly, as if the queen's honesty in front of the full council had answered at least part of what she had come here needing to understand. As the chamber began to empty, nobles filing out in low, murmuring clusters, Doran climbed the platform steps to stand beside me, his expression somewhere between relief and exhaustion. You survived the corridor, he said quietly, and now you have survived the court. I confess, Nathan Cole, I did not expect either outcome when I walked into your quarters yesterday. Neither did I admitted, watching the queen rise from her throne and disappear through the side door, her ceremonial robes trailing silver light behind her. What happens now? Now, Doran said, the real work begins. An empire does not change 300 years of law and custom because one man caught one queen in one dark corridor. It changes, if it changes at all, slowly, and only if what happened between you continues to prove itself real, again and again, under every kind of scrutiny this council can devise. I looked toward the door where the queen had disappeared, thinking about the way she had spoken to an entire chamber of nobles about isolation and hollowed-out kindness, and I understood, standing there on that platform with my pulse finally beginning to slow, that whatever came next, I was no longer simply a liaison trying to survive a diplomatic posting. I had become part of something this entire empire was only just beginning to learn how to hold. 3 weeks passed before Lord Threll made his move, and by then, I had almost let myself believe the worst danger was behind me. The study Doran had proposed to the council became my entire life during those weeks. Every morning, physicians and scholars measured my vital signs, before and after brief, closely supervised sessions, where I sat across from the queen, while trained shield bearers monitored the space between us, like anxious parents watching a child near a cliff edge. We were never allowed to touch during those sessions, only to sit close enough that her natural sensitivity could register the emotional undercurrent between us, and every single time, the scholars recorded the same result. No performance, no calculation. Only whatever I actually happened to be feeling in that moment, offered without any attempt to shape it into something more flattering. I grew to look forward to those mornings more than I wanted to admit, even to myself. The Queen, whose full name I finally learned was Alara Venserai, began arriving a few minutes early to each session, and staying a few minutes after the scholars packed away their equipment, simply to talk. She told me about growing up under the weight of a crown she hadn't chosen, about the 11 ceremonial touches that had shaped her entire understanding of what closeness meant, about a childhood spent surrounded by tutors who taught her diplomacy and warfare and law, but never once taught her what it felt like to be comforted without a reason attached. I told her about my mother, whose test results had finally come back with cautiously good news, about growing up without a father, about choosing languages as a career because I had always believed, somewhere underneath the practical justifications, that if people simply understood each other better, half the suffering in every history book I had ever read might never have happened at all. We did not touch again during those 3 weeks. Every session was conducted exactly as the law demanded, distant and supervised. And yet something between us grew steadily anyway, something I didn't have a clean word for, built entirely out of honesty rather than contact. Then, on the morning of the 22nd day, Vashka came to my quarters before dawn, her expression tighter than I had ever seen it. "Get dressed," she said. "There has been an incident." I followed her through corridors still dim with the station's night cycle, my mind racing through every possible disaster, until we reached the medical wing, where a small crowd of physicians and advisors stood clustered outside a sealed door, speaking in low, urgent voices. "What happened?" I asked. "The Queen collapsed during her morning audience," Vashka said, her voice clipped with barely controlled fear. "The physicians believe it is related to the study. Extended exposure to unshielded emotional contact, even at a distance, may have begun destabilizing something in her psychic defenses that has never been tested this way before." My stomach dropped. "Is she going to be all right?" "I do not know," Vashka said, and for the first time since I had met her, the guard commander looked genuinely afraid rather than simply hostile. "And Lord Threll has already called an emergency session of the council, demanding the study be terminated immediately, and you removed from the station before the sun fully rises." The door to the Queen's chamber opened, and Doran emerged, his face pale, his robes slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he had not slept. "She is stable," he said, before I could ask. "Resting. The physicians believe it was not the study itself, but exhaustion. Layered on top of weeks of sessions, she insisted on continuing, even when her own body was telling her to rest. She has been sleeping less, not more, since your sessions began, Nathan Cole. Working later into the night, trying to prepare arguments for a council that grows more hostile toward this study every week. She's been protecting the study by working herself into collapse," I said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold, sick weight. "Yes," Doran said quietly. "And now Lord Threll intends to use that collapse as proof that the study itself is the danger, rather than the political pressure surrounding it." The emergency session convened 3 hours later, in a chamber far smaller than the grand court I remembered from 3 weeks before, packed tight with anxious nobles whose murmured conversations fell silent the moment Threll rose to speak. The Queen was not present. Doran stood in her place, flanked by 2 physicians prepared to testify to her condition, and I stood beside him, feeling every eye in the room settle on me with a weight I hadn't felt since the day of my first trial before this council. "The Queen has collapsed," Threll announced, his voice carrying none of the careful measure I remembered from before, edged now with something closer to genuine alarm. "Whatever this study has revealed about kindness or connection, it has come at the cost of her health, and I will not stand by while sentiment endangers the one life this entire empire depends upon. I moved to terminate the study immediately, and to expel the human liaison from Velmori's space within the cycle, for his own protection as much as ours, given how close proximity to him appears to have driven the Queen to push herself past every reasonable limit." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, louder and more immediate than 3 weeks before, fear doing what argument alone had failed to accomplish. I felt panic rising in my chest, not for myself, but for what expulsion would mean. For the study. For whatever fragile understanding had begun growing between two species who had spent decades barely speaking to each other honestly at all. Before I could speak, the side door opened, and the Queen entered. She looked exhausted, her steps slower than usual. One hand braced lightly against the doorframe, but her eyes were clear and sharp, and the physicians who rushed forward to assist her found themselves waved away with a small, firm gesture. "I did not authorize this session to proceed without me," she said, her voice quieter than usual, but no less commanding for it. Threll's composure faltered slightly. "My Queen, you should be resting." "I should be many things, Lord Threll, but what I am is the sovereign of this empire, and I will not have my own collapse used as a weapon to end a study I ordered myself, based on a misunderstanding of what actually caused it." She made her way slowly to the raised platform at the center of the chamber, and I moved instinctively to help steady her, catching myself just before my hand reached her arm, remembering, even now, the weight of the law standing between us. She noticed the catch. Something soft flickered across her tired face before she continued. "My collapse was not caused by the study," she said to the full chamber. "It was caused by fear. Fear that this council, faced with the first real evidence in 300 years that unguarded connection might be something other than a weapon, would choose to close that door again before we had truly finished opening it. I have spent 3 weeks working later into every night, preparing arguments, gathering evidence, trying to build a case strong enough to survive exactly the kind of challenge Lord Threll has brought before you this morning. That effort, not the study itself, is what exhausted me." "Regardless of the cause," Threll pressed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, "the outcome remains the same. Your health has suffered. That is not a risk this council can accept, whatever the reason behind it." "Then let us remove the reason," the Queen said, "rather than the study." She turned to address the full chamber, her voice growing steadier with every word, as if simply standing there and speaking the truth was giving her back some of the strength her collapse had taken. "I propose this council take direct ownership of the study's continuation, so that I am no longer carrying the burden of defending it alone, night after night, while also fulfilling every other duty of the throne. Doran will lead it, with full council oversight, full transparency, and regular reporting, so that every noble in this chamber can see for themselves, gradually, honestly, whatever this study actually reveals, rather than relying on my word alone, or Lord Threll's fears alone." She paused, letting that settle over the room. "And I will rest, properly, as my physicians have been telling me to do for 3 weeks, not because I am retreating from this question, but because an empire is not well served by a sovereign who proves her own argument about the value of care by refusing to accept any for herself." A long silence followed, broken finally by one of the older nobles near the back of the chamber, a woman whose robes marked her as belonging to one of the founding bloodlines. "My Queen," she said slowly, "if I may, I have watched you these past weeks, and I confess, whatever caution I have long held toward this study, I have also watched you laugh more freely in council sessions than I have seen in a decade. I have watched you argue with more conviction than I have heard from this throne since your coronation. If that comes at some cost, perhaps the true failure has been asking you to carry every part of that cost alone, rather than sharing it, as your proposal now suggests." Threll's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and I watched the tide of the room shift, slowly, uncertainly, but unmistakably, away from the fear he had walked in with, and towards something closer to cautious hope. The Queen called for a vote, and though it was not unanimous, the study survived, transferred now to full council oversight, with Doran at its head, and Threll himself, to my surprise, appointed as a formal observer. A role the Queen explained afterward was meant not to obstruct the work, but to ensure that even its harshest critic could no longer claim ignorance of what it actually contained. After the session ended and the chamber slowly emptied, the Queen approached me quietly, her physicians hovering a respectful distance behind her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I nearly let my own fear cost you everything, and cost this study everything, because I was too proud to admit I needed help carrying the weight of defending it. You collapsed trying to protect something you believed in," I said. "That's not something you need to apologize for." "Perhaps not," she said, a tired smile touching her mouth. But I am learning, slowly, that there is a difference between carrying a burden alone out of strength and carrying it alone out of fear, that asking for help might look like weakness. You taught me that, without meaning to, the very first day we met. I didn't teach you anything, I said. I just caught you when you fell. Yes, she said softly, looking at me with an expression that made my chest ache in the same way it had during that quiet night in my quarters, 3 weeks before. And I am only now beginning to understand how much more than physical falling a person can be caught from, if someone is simply willing to hold on. Doran approached before either of us could say anything further, his tablet already filled with notes for the next phase of the study, and the moment passed, practical matters pulling us both back into the demands of the empire we were slowly, carefully, trying to change. But as I walked back toward my quarters that evening, past guards who no longer reached for their weapons when they saw me, past nobles who inclined their heads slightly instead of staring with open suspicion, I understood that whatever Lord Threll's challenge had been meant to end, it had instead done the opposite. It had shown an entire council, gathered in one room, exactly how much this study, and the fragile trust growing at its center, actually meant. 6 months after the corridor, I stood in the same great chamber where I had once faced execution, but nothing about the room felt the same anymore, and neither did I. The study had grown far beyond what any of us expected that first uncertain morning with the physicians and their careful instruments. What began as an examination of one accidental hug had become, gradually, a formal exchange program, dozens of human volunteers and Velmori citizens meeting under careful, then increasingly relaxed, supervision, learning slowly what each species had spent generations assuming the other could never understand. Doran's reports, submitted monthly to the full council, documented something none of us had fully anticipated when this began. It was not simply that humans could offer the Velmori unguarded emotion without danger. It was that the Velmori, given the chance to receive it safely, began healing from something none of their own scholars had ever properly named, a kind of quiet, generational loneliness, built from 300 years of treating every touch as a transaction. Lord Threll, to the surprise of nearly everyone including himself, had become one of the study's most rigorous supporters, not because his caution had disappeared, but because his role as formal observer had shown him, session after session, exactly the kind of evidence he had once insisted could never exist. He still argued for careful boundaries. He still pressed for safeguards at every stage. But he no longer argued for the study's end, and on the rare occasions I passed him in the station's corridors now, he offered a short, formal nod that I had learned, from Doran, represented as close to genuine respect as Lord Threll was capable of showing anyone outside his own bloodline. Vashka had changed more than anyone expected, though she would never have described it that way herself. She remained the Queen's fiercest protector, sharp-eyed and unyielding in matters of security, but she had also become, quietly, one of the first Velmori citizens to participate in the exchange program herself, meeting regularly with a young human engineer named Owen Barrett, who had arrived on the station 3 months earlier as part of the growing embassy staff. I never asked what passed between them during their sessions, but I noticed Vashka smiled more easily these days, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. The morning of the ceremony, I stood at the base of the platform where I had once feared I would die, watching the chamber fill with more nobles, more advisors, and more visiting dignitaries than I had ever seen gathered in one place since arriving on Kessar Prime. Delegates from 3 other worlds had traveled specifically to witness this session, drawn by reports of what the Velmori Empire was quietly, carefully building, a model of contact between species that no other corner of the galaxy had yet attempted. Doran found me near the edge of the chamber, his robes marked now with the formal insignia of his expanded role as Chief Overseer of Cross-Species Relations, a title the Council had created, specifically because his original position no longer covered the scope of what he had built. "Nervous?" he asked, a faint smile pulling at his mouth. "Every time I stand in this room, I remember the last time everyone was staring at me like this," I admitted. "It's hard to shake." "Then perhaps it is fitting," Doran said, "that today, they stare at you for an entirely different reason." The chamber fell silent as the side door opened, and the Queen entered, not in the heavy ceremonial robes I remembered from that first difficult session, but in something lighter, silver threaded through pale blue fabric that moved easily as she walked. A design, I had learned, that the royal tailors had created, specifically to reflect the changes of the past 6 months, formal enough for her station, but no longer quite so distant. She climbed to her throne, and the chamber rose as one, bowing, and this time I did not miss the timing, my body having long since learned the rhythms of a court I had once been a complete stranger to. 6 months ago, the Queen began, once the chamber had settled, I stood in this room and told you that I had felt something from another living being, for the first time in my adult life, that had nothing to do with my throne, my bloodline, or my power. I told you that our empire had spent 300 years protecting this crown, by ensuring that no one could ever touch me without an agenda, and that in doing so, we had slowly hollowed out the person sitting on it. She paused, her eyes moving across the gathered nobles, settling briefly on Threll, then on Vashka, then finally on me. Today, I stand before you with 6 months of evidence, gathered not from my word alone, but from the rigorous, often skeptical oversight of this council itself, that what I felt in that corridor was not an isolated accident, nor a vulnerability to be feared, but a doorway. 211 Velmori citizens have now participated in supervised exchange sessions with human volunteers. Not one has reported harm. Every single one has reported something our own scholars have struggled to properly translate into our language, because we have never before needed a word for it. The closest approximation Doran's team has settled upon is simply this: relief. The relief of finally being allowed to feel something honest, without first calculating what it might cost. A murmur moved through the chamber, not of alarm this time, but of quiet agreement, nobles nodding slowly, as they recognized, in her words, something many of them had likely felt themselves during the past months, whether through direct participation in the study, or simply through watching their queen change in front of them. I am proposing, therefore, a formal amendment to the second accord, the Queen continued, her voice growing steadier, more certain, with every word. Not its removal. Lord Threll has taught this council, and taught me personally, that the caution behind that law was never wrong. Unguarded contact remains something that must be approached with care, with consent, and with proper safeguards, particularly where the throne itself is concerned. But I propose that we recognize, formally, a category of contact between our peoples that does not require the years of shielding training our own culture has long demanded, provided it occurs within the careful, consensual framework this study has spent 6 months refining. She looked directly at me now, and something in her expression made the entire chamber seem to fade slightly at the edges. I propose we call it, simply, the human embrace, in honor of the first accidental one that began all of this, and I propose that this council formally recognize it as an acceptable, even honored, gesture between our species going forward, available to any Velmori citizen who chooses, freely and without pressure, to receive it. Threll rose slowly from his place among the nobles, and for a moment, the old tension returned to the chamber, everyone remembering the challenge he had once brought against this very study. "My queen," he said, and his voice, for the first time since I had known him, carried no edge of opposition at all. As formal observer to this study since its near termination 6 months ago, I have reviewed every report, attended more sessions than any other member of this council, and I confess, I entered this role expecting to find the flaw that would finally justify ending what I once believed was a dangerous experiment in sentiment over security. He paused, and the chamber waited, utterly still. "I did not find that flaw," he said simply. "I found, instead, my own granddaughter, who lost her closest companion to illness 2 years ago, and has not allowed herself to be touched by anyone since, participate in a session 3 months ago with a human volunteer, and weep, for the first time since her loss, in a way her own physicians had been unable to help her achieve through any Velmori method available to us." His voice caught slightly, an unfamiliar sound from a man I had only ever known as unshakably composed. "I moved to support the Queen's proposed amendment, without reservation, and I ask that this council record my full support in the formal record, so that history remembers I was wrong, and grateful to have been proven so." The chamber erupted into a sound I had never heard within these walls before, something between formal acclamation and genuine, unguarded emotion, nobles turning to one another, some visibly moved, as the weight of Threll's words settled over the room. The Queen allowed the moment to breathe before raising a hand for quiet. "All in favor of the amendment," she said, and the response, when it came, was as close to unanimous as I imagined this council had ever produced on any matter in its long history. She turned to me then, descending from her throne, and the chamber watched, breathless, as she crossed the platform to stand directly in front of me, for the first time since that first tense night in my quarters, 6 months, and an entire empire's worth of change ago. "Nathan Cole," she said, her voice carrying to every tier of the chamber, though her eyes held only mine. "6 months ago, you caught me when I fell, without knowing who I was, without calculating what it might cost you, simply because that is what your people do for one another in the dark. I would like, if you are willing, to make the first embrace under this new accord, a deliberate one, witnessed by this entire council, so that every citizen who watches this broadcast understands exactly what we are choosing to honor today." My throat felt tight, and I was acutely aware of every eye in the chamber, every recording device capturing this moment for broadcast across an empire that had spent 300 years believing this exact gesture was a threat worth dying to prevent. "I'd be honored," I said. She stepped forward, and I opened my arms, and this time, there was no alarm, no rush of guards reaching for weapons, no gasps of horror rippling through the crowd. There was only Vashka, standing near the base of the platform, her hand resting lightly, deliberately, at her side rather than on her weapon, watching with an expression that held nothing but quiet approval. There was only Doran, his tablet forgotten entirely in his hands, a small, satisfied smile touching his mouth. There was only Threll, standing among the nobles with his head bowed slightly, not in submission, but in something that looked remarkably like gratitude. I wrapped my arms around the Queen of the Velmori Empire, deliberately this time, and felt her arms come around me in return, and the chamber, instead of freezing in horror, erupted into something warmer. Applause and murmured approval rising together, an entire room full of people who had spent 300 years believing an unguarded touch could only ever be a weapon, watching instead as it became, in that single deliberate moment, a bridge. "Thank you," she said quietly, only for me to hear, as the applause continued around us. "Not for today, for the corridor, for catching me before I even knew I needed catching. You never have to fall alone again," I said, "not while I'm here." When we finally stepped back from each other, the chamber still bright with applause, I looked out at the gathered nobles, at Vashka's quiet approval, at Threll's bowed head, at Doran's satisfied smile, and I understood that whatever came next for humanity's place among the stars, it had begun not with a treaty, or a show of strength, or a clever piece of diplomacy. It had begun with an accident, and a reflex, and the simple, stubborn belief, carried by an entire species across an unimaginable distance, that no one should ever have to fall without someone there to catch them. Word of what happened in that chamber spread quickly beyond Velmori space, carried by the same broadcast networks that had once speculated endlessly over a single recorded flicker of the Queen's almost smile. Other worlds, watching an empire built on careful distance choose instead to embrace something unguarded and honest, began requesting human liaisons of their own, not for trade expertise or technical skill, but for something far simpler, and, as it turned out, far rarer across the wider galaxy than anyone had expected. They wanted people who knew how to hold on. I stayed on Kesser Prime long after that day, watching the exchange program grow from 200 participants into thousands, watching Vashka and Owen build something steady and quiet between them, watching Threll's granddaughter learn, slowly, how to let herself be held again. I wrote to my mother every week, and when she finally grew strong enough to travel, she came to visit the station herself, and I will never forget the sight of Grace Linden, a woman who had worked 2 jobs so her son could study something as impractical as understanding people, standing in the same chamber where I had once nearly lost my life, watching her son's strange, accidental friendship with an alien queen reshape the way an entire empire understood kindness. Some nights, standing at the window of my quarters, watching the pale green rings of Kesser Prime turn slowly gold and back again, I still think about that first corridor, the alarm screaming in my ear, the weight of someone falling into my arms in the dark before I even knew who she was. I think about how close I came to losing everything over a single instinct I never chose to have, And I think about how that same instinct, offered without calculation, without agenda, without anything but the simple human need to catch someone before they hit the ground, became the thing that finally taught an entire empire what it had been missing for 300 years. I did not set out to change anything. I only reached out, the way anyone from my world would have, without thinking, without planning, without any understanding of what it would cost or what it might build. I only caught her when she fell. Everything else, somehow, followed from that.